On June 30th, 1987, 22-year-old Anita Carlson had a lot to be excited about. 2 months before, she'd graduated with honors from Bemidji State University in Bemidji, Minnesota, with a degree in communications. She'd already been offered a job at a local television station. The upcoming weekend was an exciting time for residents in Bemidji. It was the 4th of July, and many people celebrated by visiting the Water Carnival. Anita had no reason to suspect her future was anything but bright. Sadly, her promising life would come to a bitter end on that Tuesday, June 30th, 1987, when she was abducted from Pete's Place West, a convenience store where she was working the night shift. A week later, she would be found, raped, and murdered. Welcome to Bitter Endings, a true crime podcast. I'm your host, J.R. Erickson. In Bitter Endings, I'll bring you stories of those taken too soon, the silent many who no longer have a voice through which to seek justice. Today's episode of the Bitter Endings podcast is sponsored by my fiction novels. The Troubled Spirits novels are paranormal murder mysteries that are inspired by true crimes. You can find the novels at jrericksonauthor.com or on Amazon. Today's episode in particular is sponsored by my second novel in the series, Helm House. And if you listen beyond the episode today, there will be a clip from the audiobook of Helm House. Thanks so much for listening to today's episode. Anita Carlson was born to parents Merlin Orville Carlson and Judith Eileen Carlson on October 11, 1964, in Pennington County, Minnesota. Anita had 2 brothers. Anita was smart. She graduated as valedictorian of her high school. After high school, Anita attended Bemidji State University, where she majored in communications, and she had received her degree in the spring of 1987 with honors. During her time at Bemidji State, she had managed the BSU television station, and she'd also been an intern at KAWE-TV, a local public station in the Bemidji area in Minnesota. The general manager of KAWE said, quote, "She was remarkable. The schedule she maintained amazed me." After Anita graduated and before she started her new job at KAWE, she picked up an additional job working for Pete's Place West, which was a convenience store in Bemidji, Minnesota, basically to make extra money to pay her bills until her actual career started. Anita had a boyfriend, and her parents believed that she would eventually marry him, and I did not see his name in any of the news articles that I found about Anita. Anita regularly attended the First Assembly of God Church in Bemidji. Anita was a pretty girl with curly, dark hair and glasses. She liked to knit, and she also loved baking, mostly so she could share the baked goods with friends and family. People who knew and loved Anita described her as too good to be true, a kind and caring soul, and a bright light extinguished. Her pastor, Reverend Don Meyerson, said, quote, "She was the kind of gal who, if you sat down and tried to think of something negative about, you really couldn't. She just wanted to be the first person to do something nice." Anita had even recently finished knitting a sweater for the baby that her pastor and his wife were expecting. So I don't have a lot of additional information about Anita's earlier life. Let's go ahead and rewind the clock back more than 3 decades gone to that warm Tuesday night on June 30th, 1987 in Bemidji. Bemidji, Minnesota is centrally located in the state in Beltrami County on the southwest side of Lake Bemidji, and it's considered the first city on the Mississippi River. On that Tuesday, June 30th, it was the week before the 4th of July, and in Bemidji, the Water Carnival is the big celebration for July 4th. It was held every 4th of July and had been going strong for more than 40 years. On the shores of Lake Bemidji, residents from Minnesota enjoyed carnival rides, live music, the grand parade, and a fireworks show. Here in Traverse City, we have a similar festival called the Cherry Festival, and it actually just ended about a week ago, and the excitement leading up to the week is palpable. It's also a time when we get a big influx of tourists from all over the country for that week here in Traverse City. And I don't know if Bemidji's expands to quite that level, but I think you can assume that there were a lot of out-of-towners in the area during that week. In all likelihood, there was excitement in the air for residents of Bemidji as well as for Anita herself. Minnesota, much like my home state of Michigan, has some long, harsh winters, which is why the summers are especially celebrated. On that Tuesday night, Anita was working alone at Pete's Place West, a convenience store west of Bemidji located where U.S. Highway 2 and 89 intersected. She'd been an employee for just 2 months to make some money after graduating from BSU. Anita had an ordinary shift. Around 10:30 p.m., she called her roommate and said she'd be home soon. Records would later indicate that the final purchase made that evening at the store was fuel that was bought and paid for just after 11 p.m. 11 p.m. came and went, and Anita never made it home. For whatever reason, her roommate was not alarmed, and it may be because that Anita's parents lived in the area, maybe because she had a boyfriend. For whatever reason, police were not alerted to Anita's disappearance. The following morning, Wednesday, July 1st, the owner of Pete's Place West walked into the store to find an unnerving scene. The store had not been closed properly, and Anita's purse was lying on the counter. Her bracelet was laying on the floor near a bread rack. Equally disturbing was that Anita's car was still parked in the back parking lot, was still parked behind the store. Not only was Anita missing, but $1,000 in cash and food stamps was also gone. And I read conflicting statements about the state of the store. One article said the store was a mess and in disarray. However, a July 1987 article in the Star Tribune, one of the owners of Pete's Place, said, quote, "There wasn't any disorder, like there had been a fight." Whatever the scene at the store, it was immediately apparent to investigators that something had gone terribly wrong for the 22-year-old. Law enforcement started a search combing the southern Beltrami County for any signs of Anita. Friends and family of Anita's, as well as volunteers and search dogs, joined the search. In all, they covered 280 miles of ground as they hunted for the young woman. There were searches by air as well. Within days of Anita's disappearance, the police had amassed an enormous file on on her case as they scoured Pete's Place West for any evidence that might lead to her whereabouts. Multiple law enforcement agencies were involved, and each day 12 to 15 officers from various local agencies met to discuss Anita's case. You can imagine that not only is this a disturbing investigation because a young woman has vanished, but as I said before, July 1st, the days leading up to 4th of July are already something of a turbulent time for law enforcement. So to also be faced with the likely abduction of a 22-year-old woman is frightening, especially when you consider that whoever took her is probably still at large in the community. Police developed a theory early on that the perpetrator was likely local, though they couldn't rule out someone just passing through. 3 individuals had visited Pete's Place around the time of Anita's abduction. All 3 were questioned, and their cars were eventually searched. As the days passed, Anita's family lived in terror for the missing girl. As others celebrated 4th of July with rides and fireworks, they searched and tried to hold on to hope. Those hopes were dashed on Sunday, July 5th, 5 days after Anita vanished. Bobby Sampson, a citizen of Bemidji, was out searching for Anita in a wooded area 2 miles northwest of Pete's Place off of Highway 89 near Scribner Hill when he made a gruesome discovery. Anita Carlson's partially nude body had been discarded in the thick brush. She was covered in brush and had obviously been put in an area where she would be mostly hidden. Aerial searches had already gone over this area, but again, the dense foliage made it impossible to see her from the air. On Monday, July 6th, officials held their first press conference about Anita's murder. They said little about her death. The cause was not yet known, but they made it clear the young woman had been murdered. During the press conference, Under Sheriff Ron Otterstad said, quote, "We're not trying to keep information from the public, but it's important to keep things confidential until we've exhausted all of the leads. We're trying to catch somebody who killed somebody here." The clothes Anita were wearing, pink bib overalls and a pink and white blouse, were not discovered with her body, and investigators asked residents to keep their eyes open for those items of clothing. In the early days of the investigation, there were leads. Police seized a vehicle that may have been related to the murder. They'd also discovered car parts near Anita's body, which they were checking against the seized car to see if they might be related. The seized car belonged to one of the individuals who last purchased items from Pete's Place. He was eventually cleared of any involvement in her abduction and murder. Police also looked into a possible connection between Anita's murder and a 1985 abduction and sexual assault which had occurred near Pete's Place. In that case, a woman had been abducted from a parking lot at the Backyard Restaurant on US 2, 3 miles east of Pete's Place. She was forced to drive her car north on Minnesota 89 to an area that was approximately 2 miles north of where Anita's body was found. She was blindfolded, led into the woods where she was then sexually assaulted. She was left behind in the woods alive. I did not see any further mention about a link between Anita's murder and this woman's abduction, so I'm assuming they eventually ruled it out. 7 days after Anita's murder, police released her cause of death. Anita had been shot, suffering 2 bullet wounds to the back of her head. The Hennepin County medical examiner who performed her autopsy estimated that she had been killed relatively quickly after she'd been abducted from Pete's Place. She had also been raped. Police also stated that they believed Anita had not been murdered at the location where her body was found. Despite the horrific tragedy, life continued for much of the world, and even at Pete's Place, the Monday after Anita's body was found, people were lining up at the pumps to get fuel and shopping in the convenience store. In a July 7th, 1987 article in the Star Tribune, Laverne Mystic, one of the owners of Pete's Place, said, quote, "Who would have ever dreamed something like this would happen? I always told these kids that if anyone ever asks for money to just give it to them. Don't hesitate at all. It had to be someone who knew Anita, someone who wanted something more than money." Mystic also said that in the 1.5 years that she and her husband had owned the store, there'd never been any major problems. There'd been a couple of break-ins, but never a robbery. Anita's family and friends, as well as the town of Bemidji, were stunned in the days and weeks after her murder. They hung ribbons in Anita's favorite color, pink, from their car antennas to honor the murdered young woman. On Thursday, July 9th, 9 days after Anita was killed, 2 funeral services were held in her honor. The First Assembly of God church that Anita had attended was full to the brim with more than 300 of Anita's friends and family, including her fellow students at BSU. Anita's pastor, Reverend Meyerson, performed the services, telling the attendees that the community was suffering, and they were both rocked and shocked by Anita's death. The Reverend's sentiment was reflected in the media as well, as articles about the community's struggle to accept the murder were printed. Letters to the editor were often angry, with residents railing against their fears and frustrations. Some were frustrated with law enforcement. Others cited their anger that young women were left alone and vulnerable working in stores at night. And on a side note, this is most definitely a scary reality we see a lot of in true crime. Even right here in Michigan, I think of the case of Jessica Haringa, who, interestingly enough, was born just over 2 weeks after Anita Carlson was murdered in 1987. In 2013, Haringa was working alone at an Exxon gas station overnight when she was abducted. Her remains were never found. Jeffrey Willis of Muskegon Township in Michigan was eventually sentenced for her murder. And as we see in Anita's case, people were furious that young women like Jessica were left working alone overnight at gas stations and convenience stores. And this was not a solitary situation. I can't tell you how many true crime podcasts I've listened to and documentaries that I've watched where young women were abducted from gas stations and convenience stores while they were working. After Jessica Haringa's disappearance, a bill was introduced to the legislature that required convenience store owners to either install surveillance cameras or have 2 workers scheduled for overnight shifts. The bill was called Jesse's Law. So returning to Anita's case, in August of 1987, Under Sheriff Ron Otterstad said law enforcement suspected more than one person might have been involved in her murder, based on a psychological profile prepared by the FBI. The profile theorized that 2 individuals were involved in the crime, and that one person was, quote, cold and calculating, and the other person sat and watched. The profiler of the crime suspected that the crime began as a robbery, and one of the perpetrators was local. The profiler also believed a second perpetrator was remorseful, based on the positioning of Anita's body. Investigators also considered the possibility that Anita's death was connected to 3 murders that had occurred in Wisconsin. These included the murder of 30-year-old Barbara Blackstone, who was reported missing July 9th, 1987. Her decomposed body was found in Lafayette County on August 5th, which was 65 miles away from her home in Leiden Station. 29-year-old Linda Kramer was also a homicide victim during this time frame in Wisconsin. She was found shot to death several miles from her Adams County home. Finally, 18-year-old Angela Hackle was found shot to death in Soak County, Wisconsin. She lived in Richland County. And Again, though this potential connection was mentioned in a 1987 article about Anita's murder, there did not seem to ever be any proof that the murders were all connected. And the Wisconsin murders occurred more than 400 miles away from where Anita was murdered in Bemidji. In December of 1987, a battered women's shelter held a candlelight vigil in an attempt to bring awareness to abused and murdered women in their area. A December 1987 article in the Winona Daily News cited part of the push behind the vigil was that in 1986, Bemidji had been named the crime capital of the state due to its ratio of crimes per capita. They also cited the unsolved murder of Anita Carlson as part of the reason they wanted to bring that awareness. Months passed with no developments in the case. In July of 1981, the Star Tribune wrote a one-year anniversary article citing that no one had been arrested for Anita's murder. Investigators said they had a suspect, but not enough evidence to arrest him. Police said the suspect's name had come up repeatedly in the investigation, but he'd retained a lawyer and they were unable to definitively tie him to Anita's murder. Also in the one-year Star Tribune article, Anita's father said, quote, "This sort of thing isn't happening just up here. It's happening in every community, and I'm scared for our young people." He also said, quote, "Exactly a year or a year and a week or a month, what difference does it make? We lost a gifted daughter who had the world in front of her for no reason. Nothing is going to bring her back." Though Anita was gone, she was not forgotten. Bemidji University set up a scholarship in her name, and the student radio station where she'd previously worked ended each night's broadcast by saying, quote, "This year's programming is dedicated to Anita Carlson." Months and eventually years rolled by without much movement in Anita's case. In 2002, the Star Tribune again ran an article about Anita's case, highlighting a $50,000 reward for any information that led to the arrest of Anita's murderer. The reward was offered by Spotlight on Crime, an organization formed by Minnesota businesses to offer rewards in some of Minnesota's unsolved crimes. Terry Smith of the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension said, quote, "The case is 15 years old, so people had plenty of time to come forward. After 15 years, though, relationships change and circumstances change. Now perhaps this will jog them into saying something they haven't yet said." In that same article, Merlin, Anita's dad, said, quote, "We know we lost our daughter. That's 15 years ago. That's over and done with. What bothers us now is that this individual or individuals are still out there running loose. That's scary business." Merlin went on to say, quote, "I'm a Christian person, so I'm not worried about where Anita is now. I've always felt that the person who did this will have his comeuppance when he dies, but he's already got 15 years of freedom he shouldn't have had in the first place." Judy and Merlin Carlson also said that they were at least grateful that they had recovered Anita's body because it gave them a sense of closure, whereas many families never even got that. They had adjusted to life without Anita on some level, finding strength in their Christian faith and their belief that they'd see Anita in heaven. They'd also channeled their pain for good by counseling other parents who lost children. Sadly, both of Anita's parents, Merlin and Judy, would pass away without ever knowing what happened to their vibrant daughter. On February 19th, 2012, at the age of 81, nearly 25 years after Anita's murder, her father, Merlin, passed away. Her mother, Judy, died in October of the following year, in 2013, at the age of 73. Though more than 3 decades has gone by, Anita's case remains open. Beltrami County investigator Bill Thompson said they're still actively following any leads that arise regarding Anita's murder, and he is not a fan of the term cold case, since it implies the case is no longer being worked. As I mentioned, there is a $50,000 reward in Anita's case that's being offered from Spotlight on Crime. If you have any information about the unsolved 1987 murder of Anita Carlson in Bemidji, Minnesota, call the Beltrami County Sheriff's Office at 218-333-9111 or the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension at 651-793-7000. That's more or less what I have in Anita's case. I will also mention that there is a journalist in Illinois named Rachel Lacina who is producing a podcast covering Anita's murder. Currently, the podcast has been delayed, but it is called Dead End Road. So before I wrap up today's episode, I'll just talk a little bit about my own thoughts on the case. I didn't have a lot of time to sit and think about scenarios, but one of the things that I always come back to in cases where women are abducted from convenience stores is that a lot of times it is a stranger crime. And that's also one of the reasons that these perpetrators get away with it for years or potentially forever, and potentially do it multiple times because they have no connection to the victim. Their only connection is that brief encounter that occurs when they go into the store and they see this woman working alone. Now, in Anita's case, this person stole $1,000 in cash and food stamps, but they also raped Anita. It's hard to say what the primary motive was, if it was robbery or if it was rape. It seems to me there are a lot of people who are hard up for money that would never consider raping, but I don't know. In any case, one thing to consider for people who potentially have information about the crime and are not aware of it is you're looking for someone who in the days and the weeks after Anita was abducted, who suddenly had cash or suddenly had groceries when normally their refrigerator was empty, or suddenly had an ability to purchase things that normally they could not purchase. There is also, based on the FBI profile, a possibility that there are two individuals, which increases the likelihood that someone has talked at some point, especially if one of those individuals was remorseful, which again, according to the profile, one of them possibly was. The other element I think it's important to remember is that it was the week leading up to the 4th of July, and there's a very good chance that the person who abducted and murdered Anita had come in from out of town. They may not have been local. That doesn't mean they weren't familiar with the area. Her body was concealed in a heavily wooded area, so she wasn't just tossed on the side of the highway or left out behind the gas station, which I think when someone is discarded in that manner, that maybe points more to someone who's not local, who's not familiar enough with the space to know where they could go and safely, without getting caught, carry a body into the woods. The other thing to keep in mind is that police do not believe Anita was murdered in the woods where she was found. So there would be an additional crime scene that would have blood, and it's also potentially the place where her clothes were left behind. So all of those are things that could potentially point to a perpetrator if someone over the years had stumbled upon blood at some point that seemed out of the ordinary, if someone had stumbled upon these pink bib overalls and the blouse that she was wearing. Still, that being said, more than 3 decades has passed, so any physical evidence that did exist in the days after Anita was murdered, the power in that evidence now comes from someone having seen it in 1987. It's unlikely it's still in the same place. Obviously, blood is washed away. The clothes may be long gone. But if someone had seen it and not realized what they were seeing, that would be information to take to the police. I won't go into any more detail on Anita's case. As I mentioned before, there is a $50,000 reward to anyone who offers information that leads to an arrest in Anita's murder. If you have any information about the unsolved 1987 slaying of Anita Carlson, call the Beltrami County Sheriff's Office at 218-333-9111 or the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension at 615-793-7000. Today's episode of the Bitter Endings podcast is sponsored by my fictional novels, the Troubled Spirit series. The Troubled Spirit series are paranormal murder mysteries inspired by true crimes. If you are interested in hearing an audio sample from Helm House, the second novel in the Troubled Spirit series, stay tuned. Here is the audio sample of Helm House, written by J.R. Erickson and narrated by Crystal Hammond.
No murmuring, no rustling, just the thick, muted sound of breath. Rowan stared at the ceiling, gauging the likelihood of drifting back off. Her eyes grew heavy, the lids slipping lower, and then a muffled creak sent them snapping back up to her brow line. Breath held. She waited for an accompanying sound, but nothing emerged. Stillness and quiet filled the room. Rowan willed her eyes closed, imagined she sank into a cloud of feathers and gradually relaxed into the soft bed. Another creak sounded from the side of the room near the door. Rowan's eyes shot open. Wide awake, she swiveled her head toward the sound. She squinted, her body stiffening as she gazed at the thing that had made the noise. A figure crouched on the opposite side of the room, on all fours with lank dark hair falling on either side of its pale face. 2 darkly glittering eyes gazed out from the sallow face. Rowan's jaw unhinged, and the scream trapped in her diaphragm tried to explode between her teeth. Nothing emerged. A whimper, no louder than Garrett's breath, trickled out. Rowan watched the face, paralyzed, a sudden weight pressing down on her as if someone had climbed onto her chest and sat there, all their girth bearing down until her ribs might crack and puncture her lungs. Teeth gritted, she forced her eyes closed and tried to breathe, searching her brain for some talisman of light. She'd rarely attended church growing up, but had gone a handful of times with Garrett's family. Garrett's mother Yolanda spoke the Hail Mary prayer so often that Rowan had it memorized. She latched onto those words now, parting her lips and forming the words silently. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen. She repeated the words, eyes clenched shut, again and again until the pressure on her chest seemed to lift. But still she didn't open her eyes. She gripped the edges of the blanket and pulled it up over her face, still reciting the prayer, sensing the eyes of the thing watching her, imagining it crept closer and closer. The word coward streaked through the prayer. What kind of mother hid beneath a blanket when her daughter slept in the room unprotected, unaware? But Rowan could not bring herself to pull the blanket down. She lay stiff, terrified, praying into the dark.
If you enjoyed today's sample of Helm House, you can find the novel on Amazon.com. Thanks again and have a great day. If you have any comments or case suggestions, please send me an email at bitterendingspodcast@gmail.com. You can also find out all of the resources for this episode and read the show notes and more. Visit my website at www.bitterendingspod.com. You can also find me on Facebook at Bitter Endings Podcast.